calculation is the penultimate CBI check-in with COP, where you get to feel the pulse of the conference and the pulse of British business without having to go through security into the blue zone. Yes, it's the blue zone. I often catch myself and nearly call it the grey zone because of all the suits, but we have fewer suits and more tattoos with us today. Right, we'll get straight to it because this is very short, but very briefly, the context is a fairly high degree of anxiety over the other side of the tracks about whether there'll be a meaningful deal. It's Transport Day. Heartwarmingly, transatlantic traffic has resumed from from all European airports into the US. And we have a question, and the question is, can I have a guilt-free holiday? One thing I know is I can definitely have a guilty pleasure holiday, and maybe we're going to have to redefine them. But look, let me get straight to it, perhaps on a general level first, and then we can drill down a bit on travel and holidays and guilt and all that good stuff. But Ray Newton-Smith at the far end, regular visitor now, the CBI's chief economist. Just give us your sit rep on any vibes that you might be picking up about how COP is going and whether a meaningful deal is in prospect. I mean, Boris Johnson's burned some kerosene to come up here today.
Yes, he'll be arriving today. And I think, look, overnight we've had some really important documents out on the actual negotiations, and they're definitely in a critical phase. And I think, I think there's two important things for me that sort of came out overnight. One, there are these papers talking about trying to make, I think, COP26 not be the end of the process. And so really saying we need to have ambitious targets and plans for the next 10 years. So I think we can take some real positives. And if you look at the Climate Action Tracker, came out overnight as well, and they've shown that over 90% of the world's emissions are now covered by a net zero target. But they also pointed out a real problem that we have is that if you just take the ambition that is out there over the next decade, if we take those pledges, it's not really enough to get us to 1.5 degrees. You really need a more optimistic scenario. You have to assume that all the plans that have been set out are done at their very best to get to about a 1.8 degree warming. And if we only focus on what's happening by 2050 and don't have those more ambitious targets by individual countries over the next decade, then we could be at a sort of 2.7 degree warming world, which we know is, really catastrophic potentially for our planet. So that's why I think what happens over the next couple of days is really critical, and there's a real focus on getting ambitious contributions over the next decade. So I think that was important. There was also important papers talking about, the phase out of coal, talking about phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. So some of these really big, important landmarks that we need to commit to as a world. So am I optimistic? Yes, I'm always naturally optimistic. I think COP has been a lot more successful, I think, than people expected coming into it. But also, we've got so much to do over the next few days. And I think today on Transport Day, we know that, in the UK, right, over the past decade, we've managed to reduce our carbon emissions by a half. And a lot of that has come through renewable energy. But over the next decade, it's really about how we heat our homes, how we move around the country, how we move around the globe, and making transportation more sustainable is going to be a really key part of the UK's journey over the next decade. And that's certainly true for many other countries as well.
Very briefly on the nerdy subject of Article 6 and global carbon trading, it's a big if, and it's a genuine unknown still with 36 hours to go. There's a deal on that. Can you say in broad terms whether your members, British business, will embrace carbon trading in a big way?
Absolutely. I think it's been a really important mechanism to, I think what we want to do is use markets and use other levers to get to net zero. And I think we need carbon pricing. We have carbon pricing in the UK. We need a better global carbon price, and also carbon markets, which are transparent, measurable, which people trust, is a really important way to help us use innovation to get to reduce our carbon across different sectors more quickly. So I think we are hopeful that Article 6 is really important, and I think one of the key things we wanted out of COP was a successful outcome from the Article 6 negotiations. So fingers and toes crossed, let's hope we get there over the next couple of days.
And a whole new part of our lexicon. We'll all be experts on Article 6 before we're done with this. Thanks very much. Let me come to Matt Gorman. Next on the sofa, you are Director of Sustainability at Heathrow, have been for quite a while. We were talking, or I was eavesdropping before we came in, a conversation you were having about offsets. There's no industry in which it's sort of more central to the sustainability proposition. Give us your broad picture on how Heathrow and aviation generally is going to come back from COVID. Kudos, by the way, to that dual takeoff. I thought that looked great. Tell us if that was your idea. How the industry is going to come back from COVID and confront this massive issue of jet fuel and the emissions that it causes.
Brilliant. Well, I'd love to. I have to say the dual takeoff was not my idea, unfortunately, but it was very cool, I thought, as well. I mean, the short answer to your question is we're going to have to come back from COVID and tackle climate. It's become a non-negotiable. I suppose my starting point in this debate is that aviation, I passionately believe, is a force for good in the world. It underpins the global economy, connecting goods and services around the world, supports probably hundreds of millions of people's livelihoods, if you consider tourism, which we'll come on to. But it's not just the economic side. It connects cultures, friends, family around the world. And that's brilliant. But we have to decarbonise if we're going to protect those benefits. We have no choice. Carbon has to come out of flying within the next 29 years now, nearly 28. But the good news is we can do that. So, and there's a huge momentum building to do that. So the basic way we're going to take carbon out of flying, there's probably 3 big steps I'd highlight. The first, and I will mention offsetting, but actually that's not going to be one of my first 3 steps, and I'll explain why. So the first step is efficiency. That's a foundation for everything we do, making aircraft more efficient. The plane you might get on today is probably about 50% more efficient than it would have been 20 to 30 years ago. Twice as efficient, 50% less CO2. So significant improvements, and that's brilliant. We will need to use less fuel. But if you just rely on that, it won't get us to net zero. There are more people in the world and more of them want to fly, so we need something else. So then the 2 big options we've got are what we call changing the fuel to lower carbon sustainable aviation fuels, or changing the plane to a completely new design, perhaps something that runs on hydrogen. We'll need both, but they'll operate over different timescales. And the thing we really need to push now is changing the fuel. So sustainable aviation fuel is proven. The technology exists. It's flying planes around the world. We're talking about advanced biofuels, typically made from waste. Before we get to what are called fully synthetic fuels, I can talk more about them. The challenge is that they cost much more than kerosene, so we need governments to scale up the market. But the good news is we're starting to see exactly that kind of action. So we've seen the US stimulating investment in sustainable fuels, Europe setting up a requirement on fuel producers to produce it, and the kind of ambition that's being talked about by leading airlines at COP at the moment is getting to 10% sustainable fuel by 2030, and then scaling up ultimately to about 90% by 2050. So that's the central part of the plan. I mentioned changing the plane to new technologies. Hydrogen is a forerunner. Brilliant, really exciting. The challenge is it will take a little bit longer for hydrogen planes to come in, maybe the end of this decade into the 2030s, and they're likely only for shorter routes. So they absolutely solve part of the problem. But 70% of the carbon from flying comes from mid and long haul journeys, so we're going to need sustainable fuels. And then quickly on offsetting, so I've described how we will take the carbon out of flying through efficiency, sustainable fuel, and new aircraft. We, as aviation, we're also going to need to invest in what we call putting the carbon back in the ground alongside. And that's either putting carbon into natural climate solutions like tree planting or restoring peatlands, which we're funding in the UK. Or increasingly, it's going to be engineered removal, sucking carbon out of the air and putting it back in the ground. By the way, it's likely we're still going to need to be doing a little bit of that by 2050. We may get to absolute zero, but we probably need still to be removing a bit, and certainly between now and 2050 we'll need to. But the big focus is take the carbon out of flying before we put it back in the ground.
Okay. Matt, let me level with you. This whole argument tears me apart because as a person, I'm a huge fan of flying. As a journalist, I'm deeply skeptical on three fronts.
Okay.
The sustainable aviation fuel, does it not, I mean, as you've acknowledged it's very expensive. It has a biological component which to me thinks, well, we're going to have competition for land ultimately. No?
Yep.
Okay.
I'll explain why.
And then there's the scaling up. To the extent that it is based on waste, do we really produce enough of that to fly a fleet of planes around? So I'm curious about that. And then there's the fundamental piece of physics or chemistry, which is a non-scientist I cling to because it's just a sort of factoid, which is that kerosene is so hard to beat in terms of energy density that, you know, I love these artists' impressions of battery-powered vertical takeoff air taxis, but it's for the birds, isn't it?
So, right, there's a lot in there, but let me unpick it a bit. Let's start with sustainable fuels, then I'll come a bit to the in the birds piece, as you mentioned. So, sustainable fuels are exactly the same as kerosene. That's the advantage of them. So, they're exactly the same properties and energy density.
Okay.
We have exactly the same questions and drive that any alternative fuels we use must be sustainable. So yes, we are talking about biomass, but the focus is on what are called advanced biofuels. So these are fuels from municipal waste industrial gases, agricultural forest waste, rather than food crops grown just for fuel. There may be some of those in some parts of the world. The US, that's part of the mix in the US. They will need to meet strict safeguards if they're part of the plan, but that's actually not our main focus. It's advanced biofuels from waste, and then actually the next generation, which is just being developed, which is really exciting, but we've got to scale up, are what are called fully synthetic fuels. So forget the biomass part of the equation. That's all about producing renewable hydrogen, combining it with carbon captured from the air, so you've got a fully carbon neutral fuel. You suck the carbon in and you pump it out again, but the system is entirely carbon neutral then. But the same challenge, and this, I come back to your final point, we've got to scale up. I suppose the example I'd give, and I was listening to a panel this morning where someone said this, go back 20 years, people were saying the same thing about wind and solar. It's hugely expensive. You wouldn't invest in that if you could invest in coal or oil or gas instead. And through a mix of the right government policies around the world, the right drive by companies, investors, you've seen that technology, the cost fall through the kind of S-curve that we need to see for sustainable fuels. It can absolutely be done. We can get to 10% by 2030. We will see the cost fall as learning effects and economies of scale kick in, but we've just got to drive it now. But that's why I'm, like Rain, I'm resolutely optimistic on this, because having campaigned about, advised, worked in aviation for 20 years, I can absolutely say the momentum on this from industry and government in the last 2 years is palpably different from anything in the last 20.
Very briefly, third runway.
Third runway, well, we think there will be demand. We are recovering from COVID. By the way, we think there'll be growth in demand around the world, but purely from a Heathrow perspective, we will only maintain the kind of public political support for expansion if we can show we are going to deliver net zero at the same time. And by the way, it's not just, there's a clear business drive for that. We're going to have to do it if we want to grow. But I think it's a personal thing as well. You know, none of us want to work for a business that is not going to be compatible with net zero. So our goal is, if we want to survive and thrive as a business in future, we're going to have to show we can get to net zero.
Okay, thank you. I'm aware of this clock. You could hardly fail to be. It's huge. Jack McLaren-Stewart, let me come to you now. You are a founding director of, let me try to get this, is it Saorsa?
Saorsa.
Saorsa, 1875, I get that bit right. Yeah. Scotland's first vegan hotel. Is it also the UK's first vegan hotel?
It is, yes.
Well, congratulations on that. How's business?
It's phenomenal. I mean...
Really?
Yeah, so we opened in June 2019, so we got a good kind of 7-8 months of trading before, obviously, the world
But then absolute
shut down.
catastrophe.
Yeah, and that was definitely a bit of a blow, given the momentum that we'd developed already. I think the response that we had from people when we opened was just absolutely phenomenal. It totally blew us away.
Right.
And not just from the vegan community. You know, initially they were obviously the ones that kind of latched on and were really excited about it, but very, very quickly we had lots of people just wanting to know more about it. I think more and more we're hearing about veganism, and it's really become a part of the mainstream conversation. And lots of people maybe haven't necessarily had the opportunity to experience the full kind of gamut of what a vegan lifestyle can look like. So,
and how important is it to your customers that you can reassure them and persuade them that they're making minimal impact? How do you measure that impact?
That's a really good question.
And I should say, let's try and stick to carbon specifically, because that is, after all, the subject of COP.
Yeah, so obviously as a really young business, and COVID, again, kind of put a bit of a kibosh on a lot of plans that we had. But really for us, it's initially been about enacting things that we know that work, right? So first of all, with the veganism aspect, we know that animal agriculture is responsible for between kind of 14.5 and 18% of global emissions.
Right.
And that going vegan is a huge way to cut down your own personal emissions. On top of that, we've looked at, okay, how do we, beyond just the veganism, make the hotel itself as ethical and as environmentally friendly as possible? So, we looked into all our energy supplied by Ecotricity, the renewable energy company. We plant trees for every person who comes and stays with us and every person who dines with us. And we just, generally we're trying to do as many things as we can do. In terms of tracking and traceability of all that, that's the next stage for us and is really important for us. And unfortunately, like I said, because of COVID and because we were forced to close for kind of almost 18 months, it's been slowed down a little bit, but that's definitely the next thing for us.
So you plant trees. If I come and have a meal at Saorsa,
yeah.
What kind of tree will you plant, and can you tell me how many kilos it'll sequester?
So we plant trees through a partner company, and I can't tell you off the top of my head exactly the impact that it has per tree.
No problem. I mean, the reason I ask is I once spent a very cold November afternoon on a hillside in Perthshire planting trees, and we were all very excited about it. And then, of course, you learn afterwards that if it's a monoculture, it's immensely controversial, and people will say you'd have done better to leave the land alone or spend your money on a peat bog. So it's complicated, but it sounds great. One other question: who can afford it? Is a vegan holiday an expensive holiday necessarily?
I don't think so at all. I think that's a really common sort of misconception around veganism in general.
Right.
I think for some reason it's been seen as this sort of very middle class thing, but actually we see communities all over the world that have lived on vegan or vegan predominant diets for years and years and years. And actually, if you're kind of staying close to what we would call, I guess, a whole foods plant-based diet, it can be much, much cheaper, in fact, than being an omnivore. Lentils are cheaper than beef, both environmentally, they're better, and in your pocket when you go to the supermarket. So hopefully, as it becomes more and more mainstream and more places begin to adopt it, it's something that we'll see become more accessible to people as a whole holiday, as like a package, if you like. But certainly a vegan lifestyle is hugely accessible to people from any income, I would say.
Okay, well, we're going to come from the niche that you currently occupy to the mass travel in just a second, Stephanie. But you let on before we came on that you're talking to investors about expansion. What do you say to them about your prospects for expansion? And I don't know much about this, but I know when you're talking to investors, you have to be very realistic.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's not difficult to see the growth of veganism, right? It's, if you look at it, so I've been vegan myself for about 8 years now. And even in that time, we've seen it go from a sort of very niche subculture, if you like, into something that is genuinely part of the mainstream. And I think that will continue to grow, and it will continue to become more and more important. And I think when we started, when we talk to people about that, it's really emphasizing that actually, and we're not just for vegans, right? So we have plenty of people. In fact, I'd probably say the majority of people who come to stay with us aren't actually vegan. They're maybe what they would describe as flexitarian. We like to call them plant curious. And they're just looking at ways that, okay, maybe they can reduce their animal consumption.
Yeah.
Maybe they can live a little bit more ethically, a little bit more environmentally friendly. And I think more and more there's more interest in that. So really it becomes a bit of a no-brainer when you look at the stats around it.
Okay, and where are you most likely to open next?
That's a difficult question. There's a few places that we're looking at. Personally, I'm very pro-beach. So,
Beach?
Beach, yeah. So,
Is that a place?
No, as in
Many
beaches, just beaches in general.
Oh, sorry.
Get me on.
We're talking about California, B-E-A-C-H. I'm sorry.
Yeah, get me the sea and the sand. But yeah, there's a few options that we're looking at, but nothing concrete so far.
Okay, great. Well, look, Stephanie Boyle, you are Group Head of Industry and Partner Communications at Skyscanner, and you had quite a lot to be sort of happy about this morning, right?
We did.
Rattle through that, will you, first of all?
Well, we're really excited because we tend to look. One of the best things about being Skyscanner, which is a global travel comparison platform, is that you rely on garnering trust from travelers, that they come to your platform, they feel that they're seeing the kind of things that they need, they're getting the information they need, they're able to compare, and then they're able to make a selection, and they trust that they've made the right decision for their travel plans. And so one of the metrics that we look at is whether or not others recognize that. And which in the UK is obviously one of the places that people go to understand, is this the right one? And they frequently review travel comparison sites, and we have come out on top of the rankings once again. So we're really pleased that people do trust us to be delivering the best prices, the best coverage, the best functionality to help them reduce their travel anxiety, to help them decomplexify the difficulties that come with travel planning. So that was one of the big things that we were very excited about today.
It's amazing, isn't it, that we come to the point of comparing comparison sites. Presumably, quite soon there'll be a comparison of comparison sites. Anyway,
It's very possible.
You help inform vast numbers of travelers about the options available to them. What are you able to do in terms of informing them about the environmental impact of the journeys that they are contemplating?
Yeah, this is exactly why I'm here today on the panel, but it's also one of the things that I'm personally very passionate about, and Skyscanner is very passionate about. We knew we were in the business of helping people identify and find a flight, which obviously means that we are promoting in some way flying. And as a result, several years ago, back in 2017, the team started to think, we can't just keep doing this. We need to understand how we can help influence people to make a greener decision or a more environmentally friendly decision, and then also on the industry side, collaborate with others who are going to help to decarbonize aviation. But one of the difficult things as a consumer is understanding all of this. It's really hard. I mean, even just planning a trip is quite difficult. You have to think, are those flight times the right ones? Should I be going from Heathrow or from Gatwick? You know, all of these various things. So we needed to find a solution that was going to be really easy and really accessible at the point of comparison. And our product team went away and started thinking about this, and they came up with this idea of making sure that we could make it a relative comparison. So we launched something called Greener Choices, and this is our way of labeling those flights that have lower than average emissions for that specific route. We calculate the average emissions for that route, so say London to Barcelona, and then we look at every single flight that's going, and based on the aircraft that they're flying, the aircraft capacity, and the distance in the route, we're able to then provide a calculation that's similar across the board, using the best data sources that are available to us today to then allow people to understand which of those has the lower than average emissions. And the important thing is that we're starting to see more and more people select those flights, which is great.
What kind of a premium are they willing to pay?
That's what I was going to come to. People think that it's going to be a high cost difference, and a lot of times it isn't. And I'm sure Matt can attest to this, especially in short haul and some mid haul. Flying direct tends to be a lower polluting flight. And as a result, a lot of the low-cost airlines, which do operate on a point-to-point model, tend to be relatively greener, lower than average emissions for that route. And so as a result, we'll tend to find that it's either slightly more expensive or the same price. And when that price difference isn't there, that barrier is removed, it makes it very easier for somebody to just select the greener choice. We've done a lot of research into this, which basically shows that people do want to make a change. They're making changes in their own lifestyle. They're becoming more plant-based, or they're at least trying to, because it's more available to them. It's more accessible to them. 2 in 5 are saying, yes, I did make more sustainable life choices over the course of the last 12 months because it's more visible. Those choices, those options are there. Organic food is in my supermarket. Beyond Meat burgers are at Sainsbury's. This ease of it being there. I've been a vegetarian for 20 years, and let me tell you, there was only a black bean burger in the freezer section 20 years ago. Now you can actually find something that tastes like something. And it's really nice to see that change, but you have to make it accessible, you have to make it easy, and you have to make it cost effective. We have to help people be able to make the right choice easily.
Yeah, and that's a theme actually that I've noticed this week, is businesses realizing that it pays off to make the first step and make stuff easy. But look, we're running out of time, and I want to give everyone else a chance to come back on a particular point. But let me channel a bit of Greta and the people who've been out there into the room. I know you're called Skyscanner, but is there not a point at which, if we recognize the urgency of the moment, you should actually be off saying, by the way, if you went by train, by the way, if you went by bus, on the same site? Are you doing that?
Keep an eye out for it.
Okay, what are you going to call yourself then?
We'll still stay. Skyscanner also allows you to choose hotels and car hire, but Skyscanner is a great name. It's very inspirational. It speaks to exploring, and as I agree with Matt, travel matters desperately. It's important to share that economy and to make sure that wealth moves around the world, and flying is a great way to do that. I have American family, I sound American, yeah. I'm never going to stop seeing my family. So we have to decarbonize aviation. We have to make sure that that's the best thing that we do. But absolutely, if you're looking at what France is doing and what Spain is doing, where they're effectively making rail the only option for domestic, we need to make sure that we're keeping up with that demand. At Skyscanner, we will always do what is right for travelers and what is best for the traveler experience, and that's going to be the right thing for travelers as people are looking, where can I go and how can I get there? So we'll answer that need, and that's what we'll look to do within our platform.
Okay, so Mike, thank you very much, and that's good to hear. My last question comes back to, can I have a guilt-free holiday? Matt, and then Jack, and then Rain, we'll try and do it in that order. There's a transition ahead of us. There's lots of moving parts. It may or may not go according to plan. I take the point that it kind of has to go according to plan. But in the meantime, do we have to regard a holiday that involves flying as a guilty pleasure rather than a guilt-free pleasure? Matt?
No, you don't. But you do need to think about what you as a consumer can do. And there's a couple of practical things, I think. There are now sites, including actually Heathrow Airport's website, where you can choose to buy sustainable fuel for your flight if your airline doesn't already put sustainable fuel on its plane. And you could choose to buy just 5 or 10%, up to 50%. It will involve paying a bit more. I was listening to an airline chief exec this morning who said, we'll all have to pay a little bit more to travel, but that's right to address our environmental impact. So you could do that. And the other thing you can do is mobilise and lobby governments. If you live in the UK, write to your Member of Parliament and push for the right policies to scale sustainable fuels.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Guilt-free or guilty? And I'm asking you, Jack, not as the proprietor of a vegan hotel where, as far as I can tell, your impact is going to be zero, but if you went on a mini break to Barcelona, would that have to be guilty or?
I think that ultimately we have to look at the choices that we make throughout the whole experience as well. So, you know, one very easy choice that we've spoken about is looking at eating plant-based or vegan is a massive way to reduce your emissions. You know, bottom trawling, the form of fishing, has the same global greenhouse gas emissions as the whole of the aviation industry. So really looking about not just, okay, the flight that I'm taking, but what are the decisions that I'm making when I'm in the place that I'm going as well, has a huge impact on the guilt or the guilt-freeness of your holiday.
Rain, guilty or guilt-free?
I think I'm definitely with Jack. It's about making mindful choices and thinking about your whole lifestyle and the sort of carbon budgets, you know, inherent within that. I think aviation is absolutely part of the mix. A bit like Stephanie, I have family in Canada, and I can say it was hugely emotional to go and see my mum and my family after 2.5 years. And it made me think all the work that we'd done during the pandemic to keep the aviation sector there for when we were all ready to fly again was so worthwhile. We need those global connections for trade, for aviation, you know, to keep us connected with the world. But look, if you're taking a private jet to a tropical island every weekend, you should feel guilty, right? That is that's not consistent with a net zero world over the long term. This is about moving transportation and everything we do to a net zero world over time.
Thank you. And let's face it, international travel is an integral part of this post-Brexit economy. The clock reads 0000. I've written down it will involve paying a bit more. Mind what you eat, make mindful choices, and look at all the options when Skyscanner rolls out its next set of them. Thank you all very much. Rain, Matt, Jack, and Stephanie. And join us again this time tomorrow for the next check-in and the last one.
Thank you.